Today in this lesson we're going to look at a brief overview of the Civil Rights Movement, and we'll be on page 3 of your interactive notebook. So if we back up to a little bit after Reconstruction, you'll remember that racial laws were put into place in the South to segregate the different races. These were predominantly in the South, and they become nicknamed Jim Crow laws. These did all types of different things. Some things, for example, banning marriage between or different races, so interracial marriage. It segregated schools, hospitals, transportation, restaurants, all different aspects of society had different labels, as you can see in the picture to the right, white versus colored. We also had ways in which to restrict voting through the vehicles of poll taxes and literacy tests. So all of this was to keep the African American community out of the polls, out of voting, and kind of keep them in not as close as they could get to slavery. Really restricting rights. So even though, the Emancipation Proclamation came out in 1865, even though we had the 15th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, the 13th Amendment, all of these Jim Crow laws are going directly against those in the South. All of these are set up what becomes known as de jure segregation, which means segregation that's imposed by a law. And that's going to be a little bit different. The reason I mention this is because in the North, we had what was known as de facto segregation. It wasn't just like you went above the Mason-Dixon line and then everything was rainbows and cupcakes in the North. There still was extreme prejudice in the North. There still was segregation in the North. But in the North, like I said, it was this de facto segregation, or segregation by custom, tradition. There were no laws. It was just kind of, they did it because they did it. In the North, a lot of blacks are denied housing in white communities. They're denied service in restaurants. They're discriminated in the employment field, all types of things. But again, in the North, it's just kind of done by custom as opposed by law in the South. So as we move into the 1950s and 60s, we start to see different things changing. One of the biggest things was World War II. African Americans fought very proudly and performed very well in World War II. As you can see here, fighter pilots are pictured. They would have been from the Tuskegee Airmen. Blacks in the war were segregated. A lot of times they didn't see active duty, but there were a handful of units that did, and the Tuskegee Airmen were ones that outperformed any expectations from the U.S. Army and the Air Force. We also have Jackie Robinson that makes it big waves in the mid-1940s. In 1947, he makes his Major League Baseball debut. He is the first African American to play Major League Baseball, and it's a huge deal. He went through a lot to do this. He suffers extreme prejudice, discrimination, and he has to kind of keep his cool the entire time to keep his spot on the team. So he joined the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1947. And those of you who are baseball fans saying, hey, she said Brooklyn Dodgers, it's because the Dodgers used to be in Brooklyn. Now they're in Los Angeles. In 1954, we have the Brown versus Board of Education ruling that comes down. It was a Supreme Court decision that overturned the Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court decision. The precedent was set up with Plessy versus Ferguson that segregation was okay. It was allowed. By 1954, they changed their mind. Brown versus Board of Education was surrounded around schools, but it does set up that separate is not equal, and it starts this desegregation process throughout the field of education, which also leads to desegregation in other areas. And then in 1955, we have the Montgomery bus boycott, our famous boycott sparked by Rosa Parks. She had no grand intentions of starting something as big as it got. She just wanted to sit at a different seat on the bus. So it does start up. As I said, she is arrested for her actions that day, and it sets up the bus boycott throughout Montgomery, which is one of the strategies that many civil rights leaders used during this time period of boycotting. So some of our big leaders, and this is by all means, this is only three. There are many, many more, and you'll see more in your assignments. Thurgood Marshall was a prominent lawyer during this time period. He goes on to become the first African American Supreme Court justice, but he really makes a mark during the Civil Rights Movement because he was the lawyer for the Brown family in the Brown versus Board of Education trial. Rosa Parks, as we just talked about, who didn't want to give up her seat, and she kicks off this unintended Montgomery bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama. So she has a claim to fame. And then one I'm sure you've all heard of is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He becomes a nonviolent leader, working closely with Rosa Parks during the Montgomery bus boycott. Like I said, these are just quick facts about each person. There's more information that can be found in your different assignments surrounding the Civil Rights Movement. So some of the strategies that were used by many of the civil rights leaders becomes known as civil disobedience, basically using non-violent protesting strategies in order to gain what they want. So some of the examples, and again, these aren't all of them, it's just a few examples. We had boycotts, so refusing to buy a good or a service from a business in order to get it to change its policies. So the Montgomery bus boycott, many men, women, children in the African American community decided not to ride the bus to get into town, to get to their job, to go see a friend, whatever. They chose to carpool, walk, use a bike, or some other form of transportation because the idea was if we all don't use it, they're going to lose out money, and we want to change the policy of the segregation on buses. Another protesting strategy that was used was known as sit-ins. Basically, a group of people would come to a place and sit and then refuse to move until maybe they got service. This was very popular among teenagers. One of the first groups, it was like 4 teenagers in, I think, North Carolina. They went to a local restaurant, like a diner, sat down at the counter and asked for food. And obviously, since they were of the African American community and they were not in the correct section, they were not going to be given service. So they just sat there for hours on end. Just can I have a cup of coffee, please? Can I have a hamburger, please? Can I have a plate of fries? Nothing. They didn't go out of order. Didn't get crazy. Now the people around them. Sitting there, you might have a cigarette burned on your arm, you have coffee poured on you, you have a milkshake poured on your head, you called everything in the book. Look up pictures of sit-ins. It's, people were not nice to those who participated in this. But again, it was just a way it's civil disobedience, nonviolent, just asking for something. And then lastly, one of the biggest ones were marches and demonstrations. So getting as many people as possible together, gathering in one place, peacefully protesting to gain attention for your cause. One of the biggest marches they have with the Civil Rights Movement becomes well known was the March on Washington, where Martin Luther King Jr. gave his famous I Have a Dream speech. So these have been very effective. We've seen them in recent history with some of the protesting going on around Black Lives Matter, the George Floyd death, things like that. So it's something that it can be very effective. But again, with all of these movements, it's again to say they were peaceful demonstrations. They were not. There's no violence. That's one thing that Martin Luther King Jr. really preached and wanted to practice, the idea of being non-violent. Now, there are other leaders in the Civil Rights Movement who had other strategies that were violent, but for the most part, those who were following in the direction of Martin Luther King Jr. practiced civil disobedience. Another action for trying to get the movement rolling was legal action. Lawyers could try to change or challenge laws or policies, Supreme Court decisions in a court of law. So if they were able to convince a judge that maybe a law or a policy was unconstitutional, like Plessy versus Ferguson, they argued that the ruling that came down with Plessy versus Ferguson was unconstitutional, it was infringing upon African American rights, then the judge can possibly order them to change. And that's exactly what happened with Plessy versus Ferguson. When Brown versus Board of Education came down, or came up to the Supreme Court. They decided Plessy versus Ferguson was no longer constitutional. They struck it down and they instituted Brown versus Board of Education. People were also able to speak at government hearings or meetings, town halls. They could definitely contact their local legislator to try and create new laws or get rid of unfair ones. So talking to your state representative, whether it's your state senator or your state House of Representative, or even the federal representative and senator, all of this was happening at this time. Two big pieces of legislation that came down were the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which basically re-emphasized Brown versus Board of Education. It emphasized that Plessy versus Ferguson was dead and gone. It's ending racial discrimination and segregation in public facilities, like we talked about. All these different areas, restrooms, restaurants, transportation, movie theaters, swimming pools, schools, all of those. It was gone with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And then also we had the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Many African Americans their right to vote was denied to them because of different methods to keep people out of the polls, poor information, all types of things, literacy tests, poll taxes. And so the Voting Rights Act was aimed to tweak that system to make it more fair. So overcoming these legal barriers at our state and local levels that were preventing African Americans from getting the right to vote, getting out there. So these are two very big pieces of legislation that come out in the 60s that go along with the civil rights movement. So again, we were looking at the civil rights movement. We are only scraping the surface here. So please feel free to look into the civil rights movement in more detail. There's a lot more leaders to look out there. Malcolm X, look at him. Stokely Carmichael, you'll see him. You've got John Lewis, who unfortunately just recently passed away. He was in Congress for many, many years. But there's a lot of things that went along with the civil rights movement to get to where we are today. It's not 100% fixed, but it definitely gave traction to the African American community. Be sure to enter this into your interactive notebook, and thanks for watching.